Welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm John Kirkwood, and I am touching the third rail of the American conversation today by actually crossing over. Although this isn't really a political topic, it's going to seem that way. And I encourage you, no matter where you stand in it, if you consider yourself part of the MAGA world and a Christian, or you can't understand that, I encourage you all to stay with me today, and maybe we can sort out a little bit and see why our neighbor may think differently. So I guarantee you, some people are going to feel like I'm stepping on their toes, and maybe other people like I'm understating certain things that should be screamed from the housetops. But I really do think it's essential because people sitting across the dinner table from us think differently. Our neighbors do, our coworkers, sometimes our spouses or our children. And I have seen these conversations and friendships and business relationships begin estrangements between people who had known nothing but love and acceptance prior. I've seen it destroy churches. I've seen it, I know a number of people who have actually got divorced over this. So let's see if we can't approach a situation with care and reason and some hope to understand a little bit better on the other side of this. That and much more after this. Okay, we're back, and I want to start with just letting you know that one of the first questions, most passionate questions I get from friends and acquaintances who live outside of Christianity, who might be part of the nuns or who have deconstructed their faith, or who are just atheists, who have never been part of the faith, who are looking from the outside in. A lot of them are simply gobsmacked or awestruck at the devotion, the loyalty, the infatuation with Christians and MAGA, or the Make America Great Again movement, spearheaded by Donald J. Trump. And these people will look and they'll say, this doesn't seem anything like what we were told that Christianity is. You know, it seems angry, spitting mad, it seems cold, it seems brash and not humble, and the spokesperson for this movement is pretty flawed. And we've heard Christians who responded what they thought was appropriate of Christians towards somebody like Bill Clinton, who happened to be a Democrat. And now this fella has said to Bill Clinton, "Hold my beer," and seemed to have really not just called Bill Clinton's raise, but raised it. The thing that strikes them is most, and by the way, not just from people outside the church, but there's a small percentage of people within the church that are just as gobsmacked that people sitting next to them in a pew or even speaking to them from a pulpit seem to be out of their minds, as the candidate Kamala Harris recently said in the Democratic National Convention. They just can't bridge the divide of cognitive dissonance that seems to be there with Christians who all their life have been told to be kind, to be humble, to be gracious, and then all of a sudden this this movement comes out, and it seems to be anything but that. I want to talk about that a little bit today and talk about hope and what we mean by hope. But I want to tell you a story first. And this is a story, and I got to tell you, it's always bugged me, and maybe it's bugged you, or maybe you've been somebody who's been comfortable telling this story. But when Christians are confronted with this, what seems to be duplicity or hypocrisy about the support of this movement, oftentimes they'll bring up the Bible as their defense, and they'll say, well, listen, God was able to use people like Cyrus, right, to work his plan. And Cyrus was a flawed person. Certainly, we wouldn't ask him to be our pastor or our youth leader or maybe babysit our children, but he was the right man for the job to move God's mission forward. He was missional. And oftentimes you'll hear this. Oftentimes you'll hear Donald Trump compared to King David, because David was flawed and yet also was considered a man after God's own heart, and fill in the blank there. And so oftentimes Christians will rely on these kind of things, kind of point to the Bible and say, this is why I'm there. So I hesitate to do this to you, but I want to tell my fellow Christians that there are some who actually don't see him as Cyrus or David, but may see him as King Saul. Now let me stop here for a second and share a personal anecdote. I am a Kirkwood, which happens to be a small corner of the clan McGregor. I'm half Scottish, my father's side. And Kirkwood means church in the woods, or the woods around the church, which suggests that Kirkwoods, going way back to where their very surname was chosen, had something to do with the church. Maybe we were janitors, maybe we were in the pulpit, I don't know, but we were connected to the church and its grounds from way back. And the Kirkwood motto, and you could see this, on tartans or on shields or what have you, is Spes meo and Deo. I've seen it in a couple occasions as me spes and Deo, but Spes mea and Deo is a quote from David, from the Psalms, in the Latin, and it means my hope is in God. Now, I got to tell you, as somebody who has studied Scottish clans and mottos, because I've always been interested in that, there are some mottos that I'd probably just laugh. I wouldn't be embarrassed, but they are kind of laughable. Some of the mottos are really strange. One of them is, don't touch the cat, which tells you that somebody must have been allergic way back when, or the cat must have been particularly nasty. But if your family motto is don't touch the cat, it lacks a little bit of the gravitas of my hope is in God. So I am grateful to be a Kirkwood. I'm grateful that we whoever chose the family motto chose well, even if he appropriated it from an ancient Jewish king. But I'll take it, right? So you have this psalm, one of the psalms on tied to our name. My hope is in God. And so I want to bring up David for a moment. You all know the story of David. I don't have to recap it for you. But before he became the king of Israel, he was in Saul's cabinet. And he was a significant member of Saul's cabinet because not only did he defeat Israel's greatest enemy in one-to-one battle, the Philistine Goliath, but he also soothed the king as being the greatest guitar player of his generation. The king had a troubled mind, and David was one in his court that would soothe him. And he also had a relationship with the king's son, Jonathan, that is spoke of glowingly in the Bible, that these two had a deep love and affection for one another. But there came a day where the mad king Saul decided David was an enemy. He didn't like the attention David got. He was jealous. And he took a spear and tried to end that tension by putting a hole through David. And David ran, and the story goes, hid in the woods, hid in a cave, tried to seek reconciliation. It wasn't coming. He was being hunted. He was now Israel's most wanted. And at one point in the story, David seeks asylum from the Philistines. And I know it seems crazy. Here, David was an enemy of the Philistines. Probably the greatest enemy of the Philistines for killing their hero. And yet, at one point, David was so distraught and a man without a home in his own country that he seeks asylum with the Philistines. He becomes a man in exile, and yet his hope was still in God. It might not have been in Israel at the time. It might not have been in Israel's king, Saul, at the time. He might have even been considered an enemy of Israel at the time, certainly seeking asylum with the Philistines and finding a place there. And to his own surprise, he was welcomed and even respected by the Philistines. And yet he still had this abiding love and affection for Jonathan, and even a respect for the office that Saul had, even though Saul was a mad king. I want to suggest this story to you for my fellow Christian brothers, or even my, I can't say fellow Republicans. I've left the Republican Party personally, although it doesn't matter for this conversation. I'm now a registered independent. But as a former Republican, I'll even say this to my Republican brethren who don't understand why that 88% or 91% of evangelical support for Donald Trump isn't 100%. It's not. And it may be as much as 20% that don't support Donald Trump, and they just can't bridge the gap between their Christian values and what they see and hear expressed by this new Republican movement. I want to suggest to you that maybe this group of Christians is more like David than what people say Donald Trump is like. In other words, maybe Donald Trump, in their view, is more like King Saul. And they feel they might be more like David. And by going over either to support Kamala Harris in the Philistine party, they are actually more Israel than the Israelis who are following King Saul. Now, I just suggest that to you to think about and maybe pray about and maybe reread that story. And for my fellow Christians who are in that group, who don't understand, they think the world has gone mad by following clearly a flawed person and what some would say is almost an antichrist demeanor. I would suggest to you, have you considered the story of David as a Philistine? Now, I know there's a lot of Christians who don't support Donald Trump, who don't feel comfortable in the Philistine camp, who wouldn't go that far. And I'm not here to talk you into one camp and out of another. I'm here to kind of explain this. So maybe people have a little bit more understanding and are more tender toward one another. Because during this whole life and journey and history of Saul and David and Jonathan, David remained as a loving person toward Jonathan. And he even had affection still toward Saul, as is probably seen when David finds out that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle, and his reaction to that was pretty severe. But I know there are people out there who have ended friendships, who've ended relationships, who might be struggling right now with people over this subject because they feel judged, or the people that they are in relationship with feel judged. And there's things that are thrown about not being a good Republican or not being a good Christian, and or not being a good American. And strong things are said, and judgments are made, and things are taken to a great extreme. Now, I saw this the first time around with Donald Trump when I was still a pastor in Illinois. And I said to my people on a number of occasions, listen, be wise about this situation. You live in Illinois, right? Illinois is a blue state. So no matter how passionate you are about Donald Trump and the Republicans, you're going to lose Illinois in about 5 minutes on election night. And sure enough, they announced it for Hillary Clinton about 5 minutes after the polls closed. And are you really willing to risk your relationships with your mother-in-law, with your teenage children, with your brother? Are you really willing to risk estrangement and maybe the collapse of good relationships over this? And some of them were. They were so passionate, they figured if you don't think like I do, well, then hell with you. I've seen this on both sides, actually. So I wanted to suggest the story of really David and Jonathan to hopefully prevent that situation. But I do want to talk to you more about this situation. And if you're an atheist or if you're a non-Christian, you're listening, I want you to know that you're not alone, that there are some Christians who find it baffling that there is such a devotion and infatuation and a loyalty to not just a flawed candidate or a person, but to a movement that does seem caustic to much of what we read in the Bible and heard in Sunday school. You know, you read about Israel's relationship to their neighbors, and yes, they fought the Amalekites and they fought the Philistines and all this, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what God told Israel in regard to their neighbors who were strangers in the land and how to treat them. And it wasn't build the wall, and it wasn't mass deportation. Now, I'm not saying it was tolerate convicts or criminals. No person in their right mind would do that. But it was remember how you were treated when you left Egypt, and treat them how you would have liked to have been treated. And they were told that even the tax system in Israel would care for those people. You would leave, as most of the people in Israel at the time were agricultural, you were commanded by God to leave the corners of your fields unharvested to help the poor, to help those who didn't have food. And it wasn't just Israeli neighbors. It wasn't just your Hebrew neighbors. It was the stranger in the land. And it's hard for people to reconcile how the Bible talks about that. It's hard for some Republicans to reconcile how the Statue of Liberty talks about that. The fact that most of our grandparents are migrants from other places. My grandfather, on my mother's side, came from Mosul, on my Assyrian side, in the early 20th century, and he fled oppression. He fled the killing of Assyrians and Armenians, the mass killing of that, and he was gratefully welcomed here. We look on my father's side, and my grandfather came over on a boat called the Robert E. Lee. and he came here from Scotland, and he was fleeing deprivation. There was no work, there was no food, and he was welcomed here. And I'm a product of that. And so it's very hard for me to hear some of the reactions, to hear the vast majority of illegal immigrants, and I'll use the other side's term for that, described as crazy people, as people who are criminals and rapists, and the irony coming from a person who's actually been convicted of felonies and also held accountable for sexual abuse. I think a lot of people miss that, but just the same, to hear that most of the people that come here who we know are working in the fields, right? And we know are working landscaping jobs and working as maids, working as labor, working as busboys. We know the vast majority of them are doing that. And to hear them compared to really what was the Cuban boat lift, what happened when Cuba opened its prison doors, and to hear that hyperbole and to let it pass without saying anything is bothersome to many Christians and many Republicans who know that this is a nation built by immigrants. And yes, there should be a legal process. And yes, there maybe should be a work program. And yes, we should deport those of the criminally minded and gangs and so forth. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. And yet, to pose this situation as all one way, I think is really troublesome for some people. This would be a long conversation if I go point by point. I don't want to do that. But let's just talk about a few other things. One of them is hope. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go to this view here. Hope. I know my Christian friends know what hope is, and if I ask them what is hope, I guarantee you, in the high 90 percentile, Christians would respond with what the writer of Hebrews said in Hebrews 11. They would say, now, faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. Now, some people say, isn't that the description of faith? Yeah, that's one of the descriptions of faith. And yet you see hope is being included here. Faith is being sure or confident that what we hope for will come to pass. Being convinced of what we do not see. In other words, hope in this context is looking into tomorrow. Now, I'm going to suggest to you a couple things that I think of when I look at modern politics, and I do see some corners of it, and their approach is hope. And I see some corners. Now I will go back to this so you can see the flower coming up out of the cracked asphalt. I think a lot of people look at their fellow Christians and say they're responding not out of hope, but out of fear. And the fear has been ginned up by this hyperbole about how bad things are and how tomorrow's going to look and how today looks. I spoke to somebody recently who's scared to leave their home because they listen to Fox News all day and they listen to, MAGA voices on the radio, and they're scared to leave their home. And so there's this contrast too. There are evangelicals who see the world as the worst that it's ever been. And then there are other people, some Christian, some non-Christian, who are hopeful about tomorrow. Personally, to me, at my age, hope to me is, do I believe in my children? Do I see them as actually better than me, more capable? And I do. Each generation does get better. we do end the previous prejudices and biases. We do slam the door on what our parents or grandparents believed that just wasn't right. That was part of their Plato's cave that the new generation has escaped. And I'm not saying my children's generation is going to be perfect. You know, there are people who look at it and they find certain things that bother them. But there is the contrast with the curmudgeon, the old man, the get off my lawn view. Now, how does this play into Christianity? I would suggest two things to you. There is some Christian cosmology, and there is some Christian eschatology that is anti-hope, that plays against hope, even the hope that we read about in the Bible. And let me give you a couple examples. Christian cosmology. There is a branch of Christian cosmology, and I will grant you most of it is in the Protestant world, which is the world I come from. So I'm giving a pass to the Eastern Church here and even probably some of my Roman Catholic friends. But in the evangelical world, there's this idea, and a lot of it comes out of Calvinism, but it resonates in even non-Calvinist areas. And it's the tea of the tulip. It's total depravity. It's this idea that man is fatally flawed, that you are totally depraved, that you are wretched, humanity is wretched, and that we are hellbound and hell-deserving. And I've heard this growing up. I heard it preached, and I didn't come from a Calvinist background, but I heard this growing up, that we are totally depraved wretches, hellbound and hell-deserving, and apart from God, we can't do anything, and apart from faith, God doesn't recognize anything as beautiful or good. So even if a famous actor builds a hospital system like St. Jude's, that's really not a good thing because he wasn't a Christian. I've heard this from the pulpit and from the Sunday school room growing up. That's one view. It's a very negative view of humanity. Oftentimes it's contrasted to something like the Humanist Manifesto that has a little bit more hope in humanity, or humanism that has more hope in humanity. It's certainly a contrast to what I see as one of the keys to understanding human civilization, and that is spiral dynamics, the upward spiral of human civilization that takes us further and further away from the primal thinking we had hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. And it takes us to a higher plane, even though there's concerns all the way up. There is no doubt that the vast majority of slavery around the world right now, and I know there's still slavery, but it's mostly rejected by the major countries. There's no slave economy anymore in the UK or in the Americas, and that is a positive thing up the spiral. Now there's still things we could look at today and find problems, and there's new challenges for our children to overcome. And yet that upward spiral is not something that is recognized by Christian cosmology in some corners. Christian eschatology, this idea that the end times, that we may be living in the end times, that things have to get worse and worse, and then in the bottom of the ninth inning, just as Satan and Antichrist are going to have their victory, Jesus comes back and rights all the wrongs and kills a lot of people, contrary to the nature of the Jesus we find in the Gospels. But this is a warrior Jesus. He comes back and he destroys all the evil. And this, by the way, this view is not just Christian eschatology. It's Islamic eschatology, right? And so this view has to view the world not on an upward spiral, but on a downward spiral. And so this is the kind of thing that paralyzes a person to not go out of the house in a time that clearly, if you look at all the factors, we're clearly much better than we were even 50 years ago. And this is what's stunning to me. is how bad our memories are, because I meet people who think this is the most trying time in American history. American history isn't long, folks, a few hundred years. It's something we could study and know about. And I gotta tell you, this isn't the most trying time in American history. You don't have to go back very far. You can go back to the 60s and 70s and see a more trying time. In the 60s and 70s, with racial tension, with Vietnam, with the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK, on, with the Weather Underground, with homegrown terrorists, with the marches in the street, with you don't have to go back far and find that it was worse for women 50 or 60 years ago. It was worse for African Americans 50 or 60 years ago. It was worse for a lot of people in different situations back then. It was a time when women couldn't even get a credit card. Not too long ago. Couldn't vote. Not too long ago. Where our black brothers and sisters couldn't order a ham sandwich at the Woolworth counter. Had to drink from a separate faucet or go into a separate washroom. So I think this eschatology and cosmology stuff in Christianity really aids in their infatuation with a movement that kind of aligns with that kind of says nothing's been as bad as this. That kind of says, look how bad it is, and you need a Messiah to get you out of this. I'm not saying this as an excuse, because you have to deny a lot of what you see in the Bible to still follow that movement. To support somebody who isn't kind, who isn't humble. And the Bible describes good leadership. Even those who think Cyrus and David are a picture of the current MAGA situation. The Bible describes what to look for in leaders, and it doesn't describe the current candidate for the Republican Party. It just doesn't. You have to be blind to suggest that. And this is why some people look at Christians and say, what the hell's going on over there? Well, I'm trying to suggest to you that they do have little Christian handholds to point to. And maybe it's just the abortion issue. But they do have places where they'd point to and say, this is Christian, that's not. So here I stand. And they're willing to swallow all kinds of things. Now, you've also met people who are pocketbook issue voters. And they don't care. They don't hear, they don't see any of the flaws in their candidate. All they know is their 401k might be better, their taxes will be lower, and they're willing to settle for that merely on that basis. And that bothers me too, as somebody who really acknowledges that although the founding generation was flawed, they had some things that modern adherents don't. They were willing to sacrifice or to put at risk their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Their fortunes. They were willing to have less to do what was right. Their sacred honor. They weren't willing to contradict their sacred honor in front of their peers, in front of their neighbors, or in front of the next generation for short-term power and success. So, what am I saying here? Whatever side you're on, consider David and Jonathan. We can still love one another even though we disagree. And actually, we should love one another even though we disagree. I have a dear friend. He's very close to the family. We are on opposite ends of the spectrum. And yet he'd be in my foxhole if and he's been there for me when my child died. And I love him in spite of the fact we have different differences here. Because this isn't the priority, folks. It might be very serious, it might be very important, and it might affect the future of America. I am very passionate about democracy and what we pass on to our children. And yet, we Christians who actually believe in love thy neighbor and love thine enemy, we really need to live up to that. Even if our neighbor or our enemy is our mother-in-law or our brother or, our boss or those that work for us. So I'm not asking you to compromise your principles, but I am asking those of you who share the principles I do, that some would call biblical. I don't like that term, but and I don't even like Christian principles, because oftentimes that aligns with systematic theology and not the person and the words of Jesus Christ. So those of us who are influenced and live in awe of what Jesus did and said, and the example he set forward, and the stories he told about how to love radically and how to live radically, actually. The idea that when he is tempted by his adversary in the wilderness, the temptation to power, to be Lord of all the nations, was rejected. The temptation to plenty, to have a full stomach, was rejected. I think there are many Christians who live in the shadow of that example who fail to that temptation. So hope, to me, in contrast to fear, who I see fear as just a ruling kind of dynamic with many of the people who are called by Christ's name. Even though we're told not to fear over and over and over, they've been ginned up to fear those shadows on the cave wall, and to react out of fear and to react out of loathing instead of reacting out of hope and love and wisdom. To me, at my age, hope really is, do I believe in Connor and Peyton? Do I believe in their friends that I've met, who I've been so impressed with? Do I believe that tomorrow will be better? Or can be better, at least? Do I believe that they're able to tackle tomorrow's challenges with wisdom and a pure heart? And I do believe in my children. That's not hard for me. I do have hope, and I'm not an optimist at heart. I'd say I'm a realist, and yet I do know, as somebody who has been passionate about history, I know that there are some periods where there's a downward trend, but mostly, if we stand back and we look at human civilization, the evolutionary psychologists are right. There is an upward spiral, a spiral dynamic that goes through from the very primal idea of just I to a more conscious level of, no, it can't just be I or my tribe. It's got to be we. To an even higher conscious level of everybody. Which, by the way, you find in the teaching of Jesus Christ, who takes not just love your neighbor, which is we, to love your enemy, which is everybody. All right. This is a subject that probably can go on, but I did want to at least suggest these few things for you. Is it possible that you are David in exile, my friend? That you are a proud Israeli living with the Philistines because you see and you are courageous enough to sense that the king is mad? Is it possible that you still have a wonderful relationship with the king's son, Jonathan. You love him. There's nothing can stop that. The fact that you're on differing sides cannot stop that. And is there something to the way we understand cosmology and eschatology that may be flawed in how we view not just tomorrow, but how we view today? My father used to say, you know, people don't understand it. You don't understand it, he'd say to me. And not to be rude, but he'd say, the reason so many people wore hats, you know, you watch these old movies and they're all wearing hats. Hats are making a comeback, but everyone wore a hat when my father was growing up. And that wasn't because it was fashionable. It was, and there were different fashions involved, but because it was necessary, because of all the coal that was being burned and the ashes that were common in the air. So just for something like clean air, clean water, things have gotten a lot better. Medicine has gotten a lot better. Education has gotten a lot better. Access to information has gotten a lot better. There are 1,000 ways in which life has gotten a lot better. But when you ask certain evangelicals what their perception of the world is, it usually depends on abortion access and the LGBTQ community's growth and acceptance. They point to those two things as how the world is awful and how the world is getting worse and worse. And I just might suggest to you, maybe, I'll say we, but maybe we're wrong about that. You know, maybe if we stand back and look at how things are moving, if we look at the numbers, if we crunch the numbers, maybe things are there's still challenges there's out there, but it's hard to deny. Looking overall at all the matrix, from life expectancy, general health, when people used to die at 29 in the ancient world, and then at 59 even 100 years ago, and now are dying at 72, so life expectancy is longer. The access we have to things. The average person, I'll say this, even among the poor in the United States of America, they live greater than the ancient kings. They have a better diet. They have greater access to health care. They have better entertainment than the ancient kings had. All right, I'll just stop it there. But ladies and gentlemen, this too shall pass, as my mother used to say. This election will end in a few short months, and we have to live with each other for the next 4 years, no matter what the outcome is. Some of you will live by turning off your TVs and radios because you're so despairing because your candidate lost. And some of you might realize, wow, I really wish I didn't end my friendship with so-and-so over this. It wasn't worth it. Certainly, if you don't realize that now, you'll realize it later. Adams and Jefferson realized it late in life, and they began to write each other letters. There was a forgiveness in the calming that old age and wisdom brings. There was a realization that, wow, losing that relationship for 20 or 30 years really wasn't worth it. Hopefully we realize it before those relationships become estranged. Grace and peace. We'll see you next week.